Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we break down the latest Pete Alonso rumors, including a 3-year offer potentially on the table. We say goodbye to the Roki Sasaki dream, but hello to another international signing in Elian Pena. As always, we answer a ton of your mailbag questions, so subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I am your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, we are officially in the lull of waiting for things to happen. But we did get a Sean Manaea, I call it a press conference from the car. I kind of like that vibe. Sean Manaea has already done enough here that we don't need some crazy introduction. It was kind of just cool to check in with him. We got some rumors, of course, the latest with Pete Alonso. That's the big conversation. Roki Sasaki's, search for his major league franchise is getting narrow, and it will not include the Yankees or the New York Mets. So there are things starting to happen. It feels like everybody's coming out of the holiday lull here and back to baseball offseason mode. How are you?
Doing good. I mean, Connor, we're really sneaking up here. We talk about being kind of in the lull a little bit of the offseason, but we are just about a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting. So before you know it, Port St. Lucie will be buzzing with guys throwing baseballs into mitts. So things are going to have to pick up at some point soon.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, one thing that we've heard the rumors that it could drag on into spring training, and sure, those things happen and they never surprise you. But I do think we'll get to a conclusion, in my opinion, this month with Pete Alonso. I just think there is too much for both sides probably here. And we did get, a little bit of a nugget of info. Jim Duquette, who is great, he had a report that it was the Alonso side kind of putting a 3-year offer on the table. We don't have the exact dollar amount per year, which obviously is a huge factor when you talk about these shorter term deals. But I think the larger point of when you hear something like this, especially somebody reliable like Jim Duquette, is that this is the first time we've heard of the Boris and Pete party open to a deal that short term. I mean, we had known for a while that, you get to free agency a player in your 30s. You kind of look for the longest term possible. You try to find that security. And not to say that 3 years is extremely short, but in the baseball offseason for the higher end position players, that is on the shorter side of things. Although we've discussed the first base market is not one anymore, where we kind of joked at the previous Prince Fielder deal. So, Joe, what did you make of this situation? I know we don't have the exact dollar amount or anything like that, but that it was Pete's side starting to maybe try to move things forward in a certain way.
I think us not having the dollar figure was totally by design. If this is to be coming from the Boris and Pete side, for all we know, Connor, they're asking for 3 years and $120 million. We don't know. Yes, the length is shorter, but when the length gets shorter, the average annual value jumps up. So we don't know necessarily where that's coming from. But I think one thing that we are learning is there was a lesson learned on the player side with what happened with Jordan Montgomery last spring, what happened with Blake Snell, even though he turned it around, obviously, as the year wore on. But now you're hearing rumors about Anthony Santander might sign a short-term deal. Jack Flaherty might sign a short-term deal. Pete Alonso, according to Jim, who we have no reason not to trust Jim, has offered a 3-year deal to the Mets. So I think there's a lot going on where the players are saying, all right, that long-term deal that we were really hoping for is not there. Now's the time to at least extend a semblance of an olive branch to try to meet in the middle. And there's still negotiating to be done, but this to me is a sign that I would agree with you. I don't think this is something that's going to linger, deep into February. I could see a resolution sometime this month or maybe early February, but this to me is just that first step in potential agreement coming together.
Yeah, we've discussed there's just not much of a benefit for either side at that point. If you're Pete, you want to get into a camp and be ready to roll. And if you're the Mets, you want to have your plan of who's playing first and the whole Mark Vientos, will he play third or first conversation. You want all of those things, those loose ends kind of tied up. And I think you make a really good point that, hey, yeah, okay, a 3-year deal. That's realistically, it's where Pete's market is. We've said this for a while. He's not really playing in the 5 or 6 year contract territory anymore. I personally would be surprised if this thing got to 4. I think when you hear 3 years, that signals a shift in strategy from Boris working with Pete here, where we know Joel Sherman reported that the Mets, I believe in 2023, had offered Alonso a 7-year, $158 million deal. So now, and I believe he had different representation at the time.
He did, yeah. Yeah, he didn't have Boris yet.
Right. The point is, now you're sitting there and going, okay, how do we start to make this back, right? An offer that is no longer on the table. And for Pete, in a way, who's not an old guy, and if he can keep himself in shape and play for another really strong 6 years, you can make that money back on short-term deals. And like you said, Joe, say hypothetically this was a 3-year $110 million offer, right? Well, that's a really, really good start, because then you're looking at it and going, well, if I have a great year, I can opt out and go get the money I thought I was going to get anyway. If I have an average year or a poor year, I could stay in this deal and try to bounce back the next 2 years. And then I'll hit free agency at, age 33 and play on, say, 1 year, $12 to $20 million deals, whatever it may be. You never know where the player is going to stand at that point in time, but you're chipping away at that number. So I'm not surprised that they've kind of hit reality on the term, but now you do need to find the actual annual average that makes sense. And Joe, I don't think Stearns is a guy that's just going to say, oh, great, we agree on the term now, let's just get it done. I think the Mets still have a price point, because as we've had many times on this show, and it's you almost start to feel bad because you don't want to talk about Pete in this light, but the reality is that you're bidding against yourself at some point if you're the Mets. There's just not a hot market right now for first baseman left after a lot of the veterans went off the board at the price that a slugger like Pete Alonso is going to command. So I think this thing moves. Joe, what would you do right now if you're the Mets? What do you think is an offer that if it was signed today, you'd look at and go, yeah, that really makes sense for both sides. I think it's fair. They found the middle point. What does the middle point actually look like to you?
I think that Boris and Pete's camp could feel like they won if this comes in at 3 years, $93.3 million, because what that does, it puts it 0.1 million over Miguel Cabrera for the biggest AAV in the history of first baseman. And agents want to get those wins. Yeah. When we were talking about Juan Soto just a couple months ago, we were saying he definitely wants to set the record for AAV among players. He would like to set the total value. He managed to do both. Good job, Scott Boras. Juan Soto, special player. But that is, I think, big for the agent to set some kind of baseline, because this is part of what Boras is pitching when he's trying to bring in new clients too down the road. Hey, we got so-and-so the highest AAV for this. This is what we do here. And I think the Mets at this point, part of this report in a way does sort of push some public pressure on the Mets to, I don't want to say fold, because they're not going to fold, but give a little more than maybe they would want to. Because all we've heard for the last couple of months is the Mets would love Pete Alonso back, but they want him back on a short-term deal. All right, well, now a short-term deal is in your pocket, and we don't know, as we said, what that money is at currently. But if you can maneuver it, and is Pete Alonso worth $31.1 million a year? Probably not, realistically, but you get the advantage of not having to pay him as he gets deep into his 30s. And, a lot of people in baseball believe that things are going to take a downturn on his athleticism and his defense. And if he becomes only a power hitter at some point, that only has so much value. So in my opinion, I think this is, if you could get to that 393.3 number, I think that would be something that I look at and go, all right, they got Pete back, maybe a touch more than he's worth on a per year basis. But if you don't have Pete here, this other solution realistically is Mark Vientos to first base and Brett Beatty, Ronnie Mauricio, et cetera, competing for third base. And to me, after signing Juan Soto, it'd be really tough to sell pushing that out on opening day.
I agree. I think you'd have to have one more big bat in you wherever you think that's going to slot into the lineup and how
And
you're
maybe
going
that
to do
is
it.
Anthony Santander, who I mentioned a
Maybe.
minute ago, Connor, who maybe is settling for a shorter term deal. And the Mets did offer Teoscar Hernandez a 2-year deal. So maybe that's a possibility.
And, it's no coincidence to me, Joe, that this is a team right now that has left DH, open right now. They really have. Whatever they want to do at that spot, they ultimately can. We'd heard that they were around Jock Peterson in terms of, free agency. They were sniffing around, but he went to the Rangers. And other than that, we haven't heard a lot of buzz around Jesse Winker. Really anything at all, honestly. The DH market generally moves slow for veterans. And like you said, Joe, maybe that is a pivot strategy of the Mets where they go, okay, wow, we lost Pete Alonso, but now we left DH open because we like a Santander who, let's be real, hit 44 home runs last year. We like him in that spot on a short-term fix, and we're going to see what we have at third base. And these are all the lingering parts, and it's a negotiation for a reason. Like you said, Joe, the Boris camp comes to the Mets and says, okay, we're willing to play ball at 3 years. Then what are you going to do with the annual average? And like you said, the Mets most likely have to move to a first baseman annual average record-setting number. And that largely means so little
Right.
on the Mets side of things. For an agent, yeah.
Like if they're willing to, let's just throw out a number for the sake of it. Like if they're willing to pay him $26 million a year on a 3-year deal, I hate to say this about someone else's money, but is $5 million really standing in the way of having Pete Alonso or not?
No, and the Mets aren't in a situation, if you keep up with this side of things, that they're just in luxury tax hell, right? They're not in this
Right.
like where every minuscule million counts right now for them on that side of things as well. And I mean, hey, maybe we see some deferrals in this. You never know. It's
Yeah.
nothing is shocking at this point. Maybe this is maybe that's the money that's deferred that gets it over the hump that Pete has to be willing to take on that deferral, but the Mets are willing to go there because it saves them a little bit on the tax, which will be something very, very interesting to watch. So some movement here. We'll see what happens. Ultimately, we can't say it enough. We think at the end of the day, what makes sense for both sides financially, from a baseball perspective, from a marketing perspective, is that Pete Alonso ends up back with the Mets at this point in time. And I think the Mets would be more than willing to give him the opt-outs that he would obviously want on a short-term deal, Joe, because the Mets are in a place where I think they partially love flexibility. I really
Yeah.
do. I think they look at it and go, hey, you're telling me that we got to give an opt-out, and the best case, worst case is that, hey, Pete has a great year for us on a $31 million deal, and then he opts out, and then we're going to go play in the Vlad Guerrero Jr. sweepstakes, or we can find a way to get Pete back here, or we can make this move or that move, or we can get younger. Joe, I think that's something that David Stearns kind of gets a little bit of adrenaline off of, is having flexibility year by year.
He's been very open about that too, Connor. He has said publicly that he doesn't want it just to be you have a big winter or you could just pursue the top guys this winter. He wants to at least be in the conversation for these players year in and year out. And the more long-term money you tie into players, the less flexibility you have to do that. So, yeah, if they can keep Pete at an opt-out, I don't think the Mets would be at all upset if the situation arose that Pete Alonso was so good that he opted out after 2025.
Absolutely. All right. So that I would say that ties up our Pete segment of the show, but we do have one 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to leave us a 5-star review with a question, we always answer them on the show. This is from Olasage. Why not 5 years? I'm confused regarding the reluctancy to sign Pete to a longer contract, and here's why. They just signed Soto to a contract that is giving him at least 5 years at the end, where chances are he won't even be playing ball anymore. And if he is, certainly not the level he is now. So what is the difference if you sign Pete for 5 years and only get 3 out of him, possibly more as a DH?
The market, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't like I understand the question and the point is valid that they signed Juan Soto forever, but that is what it took to sign Juan Soto. It is not going to take I don't think it is going to take 5 years to sign Pete Alonso simply because that is not out there from anybody else. And the Mets don't have any need just because they have the money to extend so far from the market just to appease somebody. Like I don't know what the necessarily the reason would be to extend to that level, but yeah, the market dictates where a player is at, and if Pete had 5-year offers from somebody, the Mets would have to consider if they wanted to match that or not. But the way it's set up right now, we don't even know if he has any offers, and they came to the Mets with that 3-year offer. We don't know if anyone else even wants to do that with Alonso. So a lot to unpack, but it's mainly just the market says what Pete Alonso is worth right now.
Right. So, yeah, there's a little bit to unpack here, and I understand the sentiment. I think that one, I totally agree, Joe. It's the market and bidding against yourself. And number two, I think it's a fair point with Soto, but the larger point is you got to decide who are the guys that you are willing to do that for, because that list needs to be extremely short. You don't want to be living in a world right now where you're going to have a ton of those guys at the same time, where you're going to be carrying $100 million of guys that aren't even on your team anymore. That's what you want to avoid right now. So, I mean, you don't have to look very far right now. Look across town. You think the Yankees want the end of the contracts for DJ LeMahieu, Giancarlo Stanton? You think they want those contracts at the end of those?
Nope. Nope.
Carlos Rodon, Marcus Stroman. And I understand those aren't all Juan Soto. They're not Juan Soto level deals. Stanton's was a massive deal at the time.
Right.
LeMahieu's wasn't a joke on terms of term, and Rodon's was a big pitching deal. You don't want to be carrying multiple deals like that because it can hurt your flexibility. So the Mets are willing to kind of pay the price on Soto's end for what he will be now. But you don't want to make a habit of that. That's not, and there's a very real world that people don't want to admit it because we're Mets fans and we love Pete Alonso. He's a homegrown talent. He means a lot to this team. There's a real world where at age 35, Pete Alonso is just not only not a first baseman, but not the same kind of force he has been at the plate anymore. The numbers are the numbers. Like he's been fine the last 2 years, but they're not trending the right way. And now we're talking 4 years from now, 5 years from now. So that is why David Stearns is in the chair he's in, because he needs to take the emotional side out of it that Steve Cohen as owner understandably probably has. He owns the team. He's a fan of the team. His family is a fan of the team. He is an owner that has relationships with players. I think that's a really, really good thing. But you know what you do? And this is why people have agents in the media industry, in sports, because you need a middleman to take the emotions out of these negotiations and conversations. And that's what Stearns and his team are, Joe.
That is their responsibility. And as much as it is frustrating, and I totally get Mets fans being frustrated that Pete Alonso is not resolved yet and he's not a Met. And look, there's of course a world that he ends up somewhere that's not the Mets. We don't think that's going to be the outcome, but it certainly could happen. But that's what this is. This is all about playing the market and not reacting emotionally. And David Stearns is one of the best in the sport at doing it. And I think that's going to lead to a satisfactory outcome for the Mets. And the only thing is how happy is Pete Alonso that all these things are happening around him? I understand that point of view, but you can't just give a guy a longer contract than what your internal system say he's worth and what the market says he's worth just to make him feel good, I guess.
All right, let's move over to some more player news. The Mets are officially not going to be landing Roki Sasaki, the Japanese pitching sensation. And as many expected, Joe, this truly feels like it's down to the Dodgers and Padres. And I think the baseball world is at the point now when not only an international player of Sasaki's caliber is available, but really any player of that caliber is available. It's always a surprise when they don't end up with the Dodgers at this point. It's why we had about a 3-week party over Juan Soto being a Met. So I want to get to the Mets side of this in a second, Joe, specifically what's next, because what's next is really, really exciting if you're a Met fan. That's the beauty of this. It was almost like you couldn't lose in this scenario, and we're going to talk about Elian Pena. But break it down for me with Sasaki here, Joe. I mean, do you have a prediction where he's ultimately going to go? And is this kind of disappointing that there was a lot of hype around this and there was a long list of teams, but at the end of the day, it's basically what we all saw coming and there was no twist and turn?
I was hoping for some fun, and maybe there's that slight touch of fun that he just out of the blue went to Toronto to visit the
That
Blue
would be
Jays,
interesting.
and they're a finalist. I go back to when Joel Wolf, his agent, spoke at the winter meetings. He essentially said it might be good for Roki if he ended up in a smaller market because the media in Japan got to him, and that all of a sudden, that to me was like, maybe New York is not quite the fit. And then Wolf tried to kind of backtrack on that stuff, but I'll tell you, I didn't forget. I remember. So I wonder, does a team like Toronto, who he did go visit the city, does that interest Sasaki more than we think? I think the Padres are squarely in play. You obviously have to be cognizant of what's going on with their ownership, with the fight between Peter Seidler's wife and Peter Seidler's brother, I believe. Kind of a lot of weird things happening in San Diego right now. And then you have just the juggernaut that is the Dodgers that, as you said, they pull in essentially every Japanese player, it feels like, at this point in time. So I wouldn't bet against the Dodgers getting him, but I'm going to root against the Dodgers getting him.
Yeah, I think the entire baseball world is. I think the entire baseball world has a little bit of just Dodgers fatigue of it almost feels like at times they're playing on easy mode because this is one, if you haven't kept up with the Roki Sasaki sweepstakes, that the money's even for everyone. Like you can't, this isn't a, hey,
It's even
Steve
less
Cohen
for the
offer
Dodgers,
nine.
actually. They have a smaller pool than both the Blue Jays and the Padres do.
That's a good point. So maybe they can acquire some more, but ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
yes, this isn't a money chase. This is a, what does your destination do for me kind of chase. And that is very important because the Mets here have a elite, I wouldn't call it a backup plan because this was always the plan before Sasaki kind of surprisingly entered the fray of signing Elian Pena, Joe, who is a highly touted international signing. I believe this will be the biggest bonus the Mets ever give out to an international signing. And
Yeah.
right, yeah, and he is technically, by most rankings, the number one player, or at the time these negotiations were happening, and they're not official yet, the number one player in this class, right, Joe?
I think if Roki Sasaki didn't exist this offseason, there would be a lot more like excitement and fanfare kind of surrounding the Pena thing. And this is something that's been in the works for probably a couple years at this point. But to your point, Baseball America ranks him as the number one non-Sasaki international free agent, and MLB Pipeline ranks him as the number two non-Sasaki international free agent. And the Mets have not historically shopped at this level. Their international free agency strategy has typically been sign one guy for about a couple $1,000,000 and then spread the money around, get another $1,000,000 guy, get a couple upper six figures. And they found different levels of success at all levels of kind of how they've gone through this. This is the first time since I've been covering that the Mets have gone to the top of the food chain. And they're going to be signing Elian Pena for an estimated $5 million. And if you listen to this on Wednesday, you might know what that actual figure is. I don't know if it's 5 flat, but it's in that neighborhood, which is going to be the biggest bonus issue to, again, anybody not named Roki Sasaki this period. And what stands out about Pena is he is the best combination of hit tool and power tool in this class. Athletically, he's not not anything to write home about. He's probably an average athlete, and most project that he will be a third baseman long term. But as he physically matures, we're a long way from this, but he has the potential to be a pretty special type of player that could be a 25, 30 home run type of bat at third base. And if you watch videos of him, just go on YouTube and search for Elian Pena Mets, and you'll find a video from Baseball America showing him hitting and fielding. It is such an easy swing. It looks like he's taking just basic batting practice, and then they zoom the camera out and the ball's going over the fence. So it's very special stuff. And the Mets, I could tell you, are very, very excited to be able to bring Pena into the fold. And as we move forward over the next couple of months, when I eventually re-rank my prospects in the system, this has never happened since I've been ranking. Elian Pena is going to find his way into the top 10 right away.
Man, that says everything right there, because it's not like the Mets haven't really beefed up the farm system over the last 2 years. There are names there. There is talent there. It just goes to show you the pedigree and the level of prospect that this guy can be quickly. And like you said, whenever you have international signings for 17-year-olds, there needs to be some kind of level of patience, Joe. But
yeah,
this is a serious investment and an exciting one, and a great addition, and a change in strategy from typically what we're used to the Mets doing over the last couple of years, or really since you've been doing this. All right, so the rest of the offseason, the bullpen market has barely moved a muscle here, Joe. I said jokingly before, but not jokingly. There's really been not a peep around Jesse Winker and a lot of the, DH options. If you listen to Nick Castellanos, Jose Iglesias should have won the National League MVP last year, and he's still out there somehow in free agency, despite all of that.
Can't believe it.
Let's circle back and just start with the bullpen. I mean, my stance hasn't changed, Joe. I think the Mets are going to sign one of the top 5 arms remaining, and that could very well be somebody they met with in Tanner Scott. I think the Mets are going to give out a bullpen deal with some term. I could even see 3 years of pretty high money. I just think they don't want to go into the season not having the bridge to Diaz. And if they truly are invested in the Clay Holmes starter experiment, they don't have the bridge to Diaz right now confidently. And you'd rather pay for that and take a little risk now than surrender a high-profile prospect at the deadline for a reliever that, could come over and not even give you what you need.
The bullpen market has been slow moving. Jeff Hoffman failed a couple physicals, and finally he was someone that took Toronto's money, which, interestingly enough, about Hoffman, which doesn't really matter now, but did you see the Braves? He agreed to a 5-year deal with the Braves to be a starter.
Which is not the first time they've done this.
Which is not the first time they did this. They did it with Reynaldo Lopez.
Yes.
But that felt long to sign Jeff Hoffman to be a starter. But either way, Jeff Hoffman's off the market, so we don't have to concern ourselves with him. I am with you, Connor. I think the Mets have to make a real investment in the bullpen, and it could be a Tanner Scott, though I do think there is a chance still, even though we're in the middle of January, I still think there is a chance that market finds its way to 4 years. And if it does, I don't think the Mets are going to be willing to go to that length to bring him in. At that point, I could see them pivoting to, we haven't seen the Mets linked to these guys, but Carlos Estevez, David Robertson, Kirby Yates, someone like Jose Leclerc, who may not be the bridge that you ideally want, but he could be a really good middle reliever for you. And a name that I saw on the free agent list, and I don't think we've ever mentioned him on this show, and I don't know if the Mets would like him, but Kenley Jansen would be enticing to me as a setup guy. So there are options out there for the Mets, and I think it's imperative that they get at least one, ideally 2 proven relievers to add around guys like Reed Garrett, guys like Dedniel Nunez, who I have heard is throwing down in Port St. Lucie and is healthy, so that's a good sign heading into spring training. So they definitely need to add a couple proven arms, as you mentioned, to really seal that bridge to Diaz.
Yeah, no, they absolutely do. When I said one of the top remaining arms, you summed it up pretty well. Tanner Scott is obviously right at the top of that list. Hoffman's off the board now, but Jansen was in that conversation that we very briefly had a week ago. Kirby Yates is in that conversation. David Robertson. I mean, it's way deeper than that.
Right. It's deeper than that, but like those are probably like the core top guys. And
They'll
what's
get
big,
term, I think.
I don't think those guys will. I think those guys will get short term. So I think that's
I mean,
all
like,
going to.
I'm saying, like, for a reliever, when I say term, I think 3 years is long for a reliever.
Well, I don't think 39-year-old Kirby Yates is pulling in a 3-year deal at this point.
No.
I think when you look at, the way I would kind of summarize it is I think Yates and Robertson are probably your 1-year deals.
Yeah.
I think Estevez is 2 to 3. Scott will get 3, potentially 4. I would be willing to go to 3 years for Tanner Scott because I believe he has the chance to be that level of an impact. The only question that you can have, and this is at least worth bringing up, will David Stearns want to invest $20 million into Diaz and let's call it 15 to 17 million into Tanner Scott? Is he into a $37 million worth of 2 relievers? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But I think the term ultimately will play the role to see how aggressive the Mets are willing to be on Tanner Scott.
And now the spot that full transparency, Joe, I really think what we know the least about in terms of Stearns' plan, because we feel like right now the goal is to bring back Pete Alonso. And then the infield kind of rounds out itself. We feel like the goal is to get one of the top bullpen arms remaining to bridge the Diaz. And it's not just limited to Tanner Scott, as you said. There are multiple guys with different kinds of deals that you'd expect. I don't know what the Mets are going to do at DH. And I don't say that in a way where I'm nervous, concerned. Like, honestly, there's just been zero buzz about this. We were surprised by the Teoscar Hernandez offer, which would have created a very interesting defensive situation and trickle effect on DH. And then we've heard nothing around Jesse Winker. I think that Jock Peterson is one of the most underappreciated bats in all of baseball year after year in terms of situational impact. But Starling Marte, who it felt like a month ago we heard, hey, the Mets would like to move his money off their roster. We've heard nothing since then. And I'm in the very rare camp that if the Mets kind of go DH by committee, I am completely fine with Starling Marte getting plenty of looks at DH if that's the case. But it does feel like, Joe, even if they sign Pete Alonso, they'll still add one bat that's the bench, some DHing, and you just wonder what that ultimately looks like. So it's probably in the 1-year deal pool. The thing with Winker that's a little tricky is you don't really get much defense flexibility. And it's not that he's a butcher in right field when healthy, which was an issue for him down the stretch. He was clearly banged up down the stretch last year and wasn't really much of an option in right field. But it just feels like Stearns likes guys with, I've been using the word flexibility a lot, but it's part of his identity.
You want someone that could put on a glove and go somewhere. Like JD Martinez was your prototypical DH that he physically couldn't stand anywhere. And, to your point about Jesse Winker, he was doing champagne pouring things with a heating pad on his back. So he was not 100% healthy as he was battling through. I think the DH is a real possibility where you look at someone like Jesse Winker, and that is one that I could see. Maybe unlike Alonso, that is something that could linger into spring training. I think Starling Marte would benefit greatly from getting more looks as a DH, and he could get Brandon Nimmo off his feet, or he could get Juan Soto off his feet for a day if that's necessary throughout the season, because he's not the same outfielder that he once was, but he can stand out there and catch a ball, and he sure can throw the baseball still. But I think Pete Alonso and someone that, as you said, is either a bench or a split platoon DH with Starling Marte, I think makes a lot of sense. And, I don't know if the Mets are willing to go aggressive on that. Connor, here's a question for you. Would you rather sign Tanner Scott for 3 years and let's call it $17 million a year, just to throw a number out there? Or would you rather sign Anthony Santander to be the DH with also signing Pete Alonso, but that being 2 years at, I don't know, around Teoscar Hernandez money, call it $22 to $23 million a year? What do you think would be a better play for the Mets?
Oh, man, it's tricky. Okay. So the entertaining version is absolutely both bats. Like that's the fan in me wanting to see home run after home run, because you're telling me, Joe, that the top 5 in this lineup will be some combination of Lindor, Soto, Vientos, Alonso, Santander, and we didn't even get into the fact that like Brandon Nimmo and Francisco Alvarez are still in this lineup. But I know myself too well. I would be furious if the Mets go through a 4-week stretch in the second half of May into the first 2 weeks of June that they just can't get the ball to Diaz. They just can't get leads over to
Yeah.
Diaz. Where Manaea goes 6, the Mets are winning 4-1, and the 7th and 8th inning guys give up 3 runs. And let's be honest, that world right now could truly exist because there's not a lot of proven arms in the bullpen. There's a lot of arms that we are intrigued by. They have good profiles. They might be something, but and there's even fair concerns around Tanner Scott, but he has the reputation he has for a reason with his resume. That's a great question, Joe. I think the way the Mets organization is constructed, I have to give the adult answer and say I'd rather have Tanner Scott, even though my heart wants Santander, but my brain tells me you have to have Tanner Scott, because I do think there's a little piece of the Mets that they're going to throw so many young guys out in spring training and just do this sink or swim thing. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying Santander is like this problem to have, because he's not. He'd be awesome to have. But I do think they want to see, can any of these guys give us more than we projected, which is what Vientos did last year. Like, for anyone that's like, hey, that never really works out, it's kind of hopeful. I agree sometimes. Sometimes you got to see guys play, though. And Vientos, and I don't think any of them are going to be Vientos, but Vientos got a shot, and he's now a core piece of the New York Mets. So can one of Brett Beatty, Ronnie Mauricio, Luis Angel Acuna, and eventually Jet Williams down the road, can one of the four
Yeah.
be an everyday player? I think yes. Like, that's my right. Like, I'm playing the odds and I'm thinking, yeah, one of the four could probably be an everyday player, where I would need Tanner Scott more than I would need another person in the lineup, as exciting as it is. What would you go with?
Yeah. I think it's a fair answer. I think I would go with Santander, to be totally honest.
Yeah,
And
it's fun.
and not just fun, man. I trust David Stearns wholeheartedly. Like, I think he would find a way to sign Jose Leclerc for $6 million,
See, that's different though.
and then another. Well,
Yeah,
I'm not saying
if I'm given that,
yeah.
and Stanek's back, like, okay, yeah, bullpen by volume, I'm a huge fan of.
Well, you could sign either way. You're signing 1 to 2 relievers and a DH. So let's just pay it that way, where you could have Scott and Winker and Stanek or something, or you could have Santander, Leclerc, and maybe someone a step above Stanek. So like 2 guys that are like a little higher. So that's maybe the best way to paint it.
Yeah, that in that mold, I probably lean Santander, because I just think it's so hard. Listen, you look at what the Mets are up against, right? We're always going to kind of naturally revert to the Dodgers, but you also have to remind yourself that the Braves, when healthy, are built the same way. You don't want any gaps in the first half of your lineup. Like, you want that to be murderer's row. And whenever I watch the Dodgers, it's all I think of. I go, how the hell does anyone get through this part of the lineup? And then when you watch the Braves when they were healthy, and they weren't last year, but when they're really clicking with Acuna, Olsen, Riley, Albies,
Michael Harris,
like, they're an annoying lineup to get through. Where I look at the Mets and go, man, Lindor, Soto, Vientos, Pete, Santander, who is a switch hitter, by the way, which is a really nice aspect of this. And then I'm rounding out the lineup with Nimmo, Alvarez. I mean, It's who each have pop. Yeah, it's intriguing, and it's, the longer this goes on, I don't think it's out of the range of outcomes for the Mets. Like, we're not playing MLB The Show on the podcast right now. I
No.
think there's a world where the longer this goes on and the lower the term gets for Santander, at some point you look around and go, why the hell not? We have the cash. Other teams just don't have the cash.
If Tanner Scott is in play, Anthony Santander
Right.
theoretically should be in play. Like it's close enough. But you know what? We always play in the YouTube comments. I see people do this on YouTube shows. Leave in the comments, what side would you rather be on this whole Santander versus Tanner Scott type of discussion? Yeah, let's see what the people think.
All right, you're listening to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Let's go down on the farm with a nice mailbag question from Evan Schwartz 2293 on YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, what do you think the odds are the Rays keep Nate Lavender? I was hoping there was a chance he could come back since he was a Rule 5 pick. Joe, these are the questions I really appreciate because we're talking about Juan Soto, Pete Alonso, Santander, and Tanner Scott. And Evan is out there, and I'm not being facetious or like, I'm being dead serious. He's sitting there going, man, I hope Nate Lavender comes back to the Mets. What do you think of this one?
I love it, and it warms my heart because I came from a place that there was many years that I was the only guy that gave a crap about any of this stuff. But it's good to have Evan on my side. The odds that the Rays keep Nate Lavender, so that where the complication comes on the Lavender side of things is that he got Tommy John last spring. So he's going to miss most of this season, if not all of this season. So if he doesn't meet a certain amount of days on the active roster this year, I think it's 90. I could be wrong, but I think it's 90 days. If he's not on the active roster for 90 days, the Rule 5 rules carry over into 2026. So I think there is certainly a chance Nate Lavender ends up back with the Mets, and more often than not, players drafted in the Rule 5 draft end up back with the team that they were taken from. This might just be one that we have to circle back in 2026 on.
The Rule 5 is one of the most bizarre things that still exist in baseball, but it's
so fun.
It is fun, and I think I like the opportunity it grants for guys that might be buried in an organization. I think the purpose is meaningful. It's just very funny the way the rules are. And Lavender, before he got hurt, Joe, was an interesting guy that we had talked about on this podcast plenty. All right, another mailbag question here. This is from Kev in Sarasota, 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you, Kev. Please lay out how the tax, endorsement possibilities, and other factors affect real value of contracts players consider from different teams. I think some soccer superstars have after-tax contracts. How do agents compare offers considering these differences? So this is a really big conversation, specifically in the NHL right now, where the salary cap has been flat for a while after COVID. It's finally had a little bit of movement, but you're very hamstrung of what you could do where, you look at players taking deals in certain states. I think it's been a conversation around the NFL for a decent amount of time. In baseball, where there's not a hard cap, I don't think it's the same exact factor, but endorsements to me, Joe, are very, very real. I think the market you play in baseball is very meaningful to some guys. And I think my take is that all of these things are weighed. It's not that they're ignored. But I don't think we're at the baseball talking point yet where actual taxes are at the top of the list. They're kind of a, secondary factor, I think.
If there's any proof of that, every player signing with the Dodgers. So
right, there you go. California.
They're willingly going. But part of the tax thing that I think needs to be understood too is just because you sign with the Texas Rangers, for example, doesn't mean you have zero state tax on your salary. You get paid where you work. So when they're on a 10-game road trip in California, that period, they're paying California state tax. So it's why you need a very good accountant if you are a professional athlete. But as of now, to your point, Connor, taxes are not a huge thing. Like, they matter, obviously, because it's money. but it is not the driving force, I think, in anyone's decisions at this point in time. Endorsement possibilities, to me, that's really player dependent. Like, not every player has endorsement possibilities. Like, all due respect, I'm trying to just think of like a name on the Mets. I don't want to be disparaging to anyone, but like, is Clay Holmes magically getting like a bunch of endorsements? I don't know. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But someone like Juan Soto, for example, really cares about his destination because he has the possibility to get huge endorsements where he signs. So I think, to your point, big, just take the big picture and make it small. It all matters, but I think it's all kind of secondary to what just the salary is.
It does. You're 100% right. And something that's interesting to me is, ironically, if you wanted to say, hey, like the tax can be an advantage, ironically, both Florida teams don't spend any money. So, in theory, if somebody bought the Marlins or bought the Rays and said, I'm going to go by the Steve Cohen model, we're going to go out there and we're going to give out hundreds of $1 millions in free agency. Maybe that being a secondary benefit to a Florida team would be impactful. I'm not going to say like earth shattering, but impactful in talks.
Yeah.
But Joe, and I know there's a lot of different, obviously, I'm just using Florida for an example here. They don't spend any money, so we don't know. Like, there's never a time where you're like, man, the Marlins they're really making this hard for everyone else, or the Rays are they're a problem here in these negotiations. Yeah. So I think that's another factor, because we hear a lot about it when I go back to the NHL. People want to go play for the Florida Panthers. They just want a Stanley Cup. They have a great core. Guys have taken less to stay there, and the taxes are an impact. But the Florida they spend in the NHL. But in baseball, I mean, the Marlins are 27th in payroll. The Rays are 28th. So it's they don't even use that benefit to their advantage if they did. And when you look at endorsements, I think that obviously you either have to be a superstar, like Paul Skeens, right? He's the outlier. Skeens he's a marketable guy because he's an amazing pitcher from the second he stepped on an MLB mound. He's on the Pirates, who don't spend any money and quite frankly, aren't an interesting team, unfortunately, because they don't spend money and they don't make the team better. But Skeens is an outlier where like he'll have marketing factors and endorsements. But think about who we're talking about. Like, that's the upper echelon of a player you have to be, where here's a good example. And this one is very relatable for the Mets. Pete Alonso. Pete Alonso is a good player, right? Hits a lot of home runs, cool nickname. Is Pete Alonso a top 10 player in baseball? He's not. Like, no. It's like you could sit there confidently and say, no, he's not. But Pete Alonso has awesome endorsements because he plays in New York. He hits a lot of home runs. He has a cool nickname. And he has those moments. And it's in New York, where New York is a baseball town, right? When things are good for the Yankees and Mets, New York is a baseball town. You could say that about players on you could be the second or third or fourth best player on your team in New York, and you could still bring in significant endorsements. Brandon Nimmo might be a better example than Pete Alonso. We love Brandon Nimmo. Brandon Nimmo's a nice piece for the Mets. Brandon Nimmo now, I mean, you look at Lindor, Soto, Pete, assuming he's back, Vientos, but Nimmo's a guy he's marketable. And I think part of it is playing in New York. So endorsements do matter. The place you can go to, and you don't have to be the guy to get endorsement opportunities. And there's certain places you are where you are the guy, but you still have to be so much better than everyone else at your position to have a chance because of where you play.
No, that makes total sense. And baseball just might be a little behind some other sports as far as that goes, because I know football, for example, obviously we know the NFL is king, right? There are big names that get endorsements on any and every team in that sport. So it's a little different in baseball.
Which is unbelievable when you actually break it down, because they wear helmets. So
crazy, right?
When players like Devontae Adams is on the Taco Bell commercial, we're big football fans. I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, oh, it's Devontae Adams. But there might be some people that are very casual football fans, and before that commercial was aired, they might not know what Devontae Adams looks like because they wear helmets. Although he's got signature hair, which helps a little bit. But guys that don't have a signature look, but in baseball, they don't wear helmets, and they're still not marketing them at the highest opportunity, which speaks to, like you said, NFL is king. That says everything about where the NFL is in terms of marketing compared to where baseball is. So, yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. Joe and I could probably do like literally a 3-hour podcast on baseball marketing, media, endorsements, all of that kind of stuff. But it's a longer conversation. So, all right, we'll do one from Twitter before we close today, because we got a lot of good Twitter questions, and I do want to get to some of the, at least one of them here. This is from Pete Corrado. Hi, Joe and Connor. I think this was the first domino we were waiting for. Sasaki out. Now we know we need one more starter. Once we know Pete is signed in the terms, we will feel more comfortable with what prospects to include for a Castillo or Cease trade. What do you think?
So I would slightly push back on we know they need another starter. The Mets don't believe that they need another starter. And we could disagree. Do I think the Mets can upgrade from Paul Blackburn at the back end of the rotation? Sure. I think that is something they can do. What I have said on this show ever since the Mets signed Sean Manaea back and seemingly, filled the rotation with Kodai Senga and Sean Manaea and Frankie Montas, and no matter how hard people try, Clay Holmes is a starting pitcher, and David Peterson. So they've really filled out a rotation. Could they improve? Sure. Do I think David Stearns is willing to be opportunistic? Sure. I think that's something that'll always be in his DNA. But when you think about Luis Castillo, if he is someone that was going to be traded, don't you think he would have been traded by now? Like we are deep into January. Dylan Cease is a unique case a little bit because we're talking about the uncertainty at the ownership level with the Padres, and they may be the team that ends up with Roki Sasaki. So if they end up with Sasaki, are they maybe a little more willing to budge on a Cease trade? The other side of that coin is if they bring in Sasaki, won't they just try to win? And having Dylan Cease would help towards that. So I don't know that a starting pitcher addition is coming. I wouldn't rule it out, but I think at this point, the Mets are content with their rotation as is. And, maybe a depth guy on a minor league deal or someone in the Griffin Canning type of mold, like another version of that could come in. But I think they're ready to go with the rotation as is.
It certainly feels that way, for better or for worse, right? I think Now I was extremely skeptical last year. I don't know if I'm going to fall into that trap again, where if they have the plan, I'm going to be like, I'm going to believe until they give me a reason not to, quite honestly.
How do you feel about the rotate? If let's just say this is it on the rotation.
Right.
How do you feel about the rotation versus this time last year? So you didn't know Sean Manaea was going to break out, but now he obviously did. And you didn't know what Severino was going to be. And Senga didn't get hurt yet. So that's a factor too.
That is a big factor. I would say it's interesting because now I know Stearns is just different. And we were huge fans of Stearns on this show the second we heard that it could be a possibility he can come here. But in terms of projecting arms and using them different ways and like that, now we've seen it. I would say I feel fine with the rotation. Like it's average. Yeah. It's an average rotation. And I think that's okay right now because I expect the Mets to have a significantly above average offense. And I hope by the time the offseason's done, they have an above average bullpen. So when you look at it, at the end of the day, Joe, why this is such a hard thing to discuss, the biggest variable is if Senga's healthy or not. And at the end, like that's really all this comes down to. If Kodai Senga is the guy we saw his rookie season, this rotation will probably be pretty good. But they are dealing with a lot of variance. Senga's health. What version of David Peterson are we going to get? Frankie Montas. That's all I have to say for a variable. Clay Holmes transitioning to being a starter. The only guy that you sit here and go, I kind of know what he is is Mania, and to a second degree, Paul Blackburn. That's it.
Yeah.
That's really it. Who's hurt, by the way. So that's why it's a really hard question to answer, is that they have a lot of variance, but I guess with variance does come some upside, and they hit on the upside last year.
Can't bank on hitting on that level of upside every year, of course. Like they
No.
Obviously Adrian Hauser didn't pan out, but they had a really good batting average last year. I actually slightly like the rotation more this year than I did this time last year. Senga, let's just put him on the same kind of thing. Like, he could be great. He needs to be healthy. I think David Peterson showed a lot this year.
Me too.
If you look at the David Peterson from 2023, I think the biggest issue was he was pitching on a bum hip, and then he got the hip fixed, and he looked a lot more like the David Peterson from the years prior to 2023. So I feel good about having him. I agree with you, Montas. I think there is definitely like a semblance of potential there, but it feels a lot more like the back end guy. And I will be happy to stand on the hill and have it fall on my face. I think Clay Holmes is going to be so good as a starter. I feel so good about that. That to me is a huge difference. Is how do you feel about Clay Holmes? And like I said, I know I'm probably close to an island on believing that is going to work.
Well, the good thing is you're on the island with David Stearns. So if you're going to be stuck on the island,
I'm down. Yeah, I'm down.
Yeah, it's a good island to be on. It's not like you're sitting there and going, I'm the only guy in the world that thinks this. The other guy is paid handsomely to run the New York Mets, and he's off to a hell of a start. So I can't fault you for that opinion at all. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch all of our episodes, of course, on SNY's YouTube channel. You could leave us a review with a question on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll look for that for a future mailbag. You can leave us questions in the YouTube comments as well. So please subscribe over there, and you'll never miss a show. The offseason rolls on. We're not going anywhere. We'll talk to you guys next week.